Okay, well, without further ado, I would like to introduce Microsoft MVP and all-around pretty good guy and super smart. Kevin has had probably a larger impact on more developers here at Intellatech than any other person because of his ability to help other folks in a way that people can really understand and grab onto. When you work with Kevin, you feel like you can do it. And I think that's an amazing thing. People that are super smart oftentimes make you feel like you can't. You get done talking to him, it's like, yeah, I'll never figure that out. But when you get done talking to Kevin, you feel like, wow, I could do that too. And I think that's one of the amazing things about our first presenter, who's going to talk about .NET Aspire, Kevin Bost.
Thank you, Grant. Welcome, everyone. Stokes, if you want my chair, you can have it. Cool. So I was going to go through and drop into .NET Aspire, just to kind of get everybody caught up in case you are unaware of what it is. Most of the apps that we build today are not just single little exes that we run, right? Applications are built up of multiple parts. There's often databases. You've got a front end, a back end. And getting those things built, debugged, deployed, requires a bit of complexity. Aspire came along as a way of trying to simplify that whole process, being able to say, okay, this is my application as a whole. How am I going to actually build, debug, deploy, and run this? Because the bigger your application gets, the more components that get added on there, the more difficult it is when somebody comes onto the team and says, hey, what can I work on? It's like, well, okay, to get this set up, I need you to walk through this README, follow the following script, make sure you download this backpack file from the staging database, reload it into your database. That'll get you the appropriate seed data. If that sounds familiar to you, that's because we've done a lot of this over and over and over. And so Aspire aims to bring all of that down into a simplified way to be able to manage our applications. So I've got a link there if people want to pull some of the stuff that I am showing. I think if all goes well, I've got 3 key lines, and we'll point them out. So for Aspire, it's somewhat difficult to define when people say .NET Aspire, and the easiest one that I can come up with is it is a code-first tool chain to be able to go through and manage your application. And what I mean by code-first is Aspire is built in .NET, but it is not necessarily only for .NET. You can have your front end in React. You can be using Python and a Flask app as your back end if that's what you want to do. The Aspire tooling just gives you that extra orchestration layer to be able to stand up your infrastructure, to be able to manage all of that. It brings things together like local orchestration. So the idea of somebody comes onto a team, you need to stand up this application. Maybe things can run locally. You can have Docker containers for doing a lot. You can put your database there or otherwise. But maybe you have cloud-based resources. You've got an AI Foundry instance that your application needs to run. Yes, you can run Foundry local, but maybe you actually want your developers leveraging a cloud-based Foundry model because your developers may not all have massive development machines that they're working on. Having something that says, well, how do I stand up that cloud instance? How do I then appropriately grab that connection string and inject it into the right place into my application? Most of the time, for a lot of us, this is a README. If we've gotten really fancy, people have scripted it. Aspire gets it down to, I'm going to codify that so that I can clone my repo, F5 run, and all of that stuff gets built out and runs for me. It also gets us down into this nice bit of simplified debugging and flexibility. Because the problem with all of this kind of fancy orchestration is what's great for me is probably not what you're doing or what you're doing or what you're doing. Everyone's got slightly a different flavor. Every client we go into at Intellatech, like there's some common themes, but everybody has their own way of this is how we structure applications. No, of course not. We don't let people run Cosmos DB locally. We always put that in the cloud. Oh, no, of course not. We always put our databases local because we want developers to have their own containers, right? All of those types of things. There's different flavors of how people do it, and Aspire gives you that flexibility to decide what should yours look like and be able to go through and build out. And with that, I am done with slides because we can talk about it all day. So if people are interested, QR code will be up later as well, but we are going to drop in. So we're going to actually go backwards, and I'm going to tempt the demo gods and see how well, oh, it launched, hallelujah. Okay, so my demo, I'm actually going to go through and run as well as show it to you. So I have a template that I went .NET new on, and then I used the Azure CLI and said, okay, AZD init, AZD up. 3 command lines, and I went from empty folder all the way up to cloud deployed application, and we're running. In theory, this thing works by saying, okay, we're going to have some Q&A rooms, and I will enter my name. I will be Kevin today because that's what I am. What is the best programming language? And why is it C#, obviously, right? We submit it. It comes through. Somebody on the back end can go through and look at this and approve it. You can see there's a little bit of rate limiting on there to hopefully prevent too much abuse. We can go through and approve it and see, okay, we've got questions coming in here of, where things are going to be. We can take these approved ones, go ahead and say, hey, let's set that as current, just so that we can go through and show it. If we had a fancy screen to go through and put it, we can have a separate window over here. Just as a very simplistic way, we can just dump this over here for now. And then we can say, yeah, let's go ahead and clear it, and we'll go ahead and mark that as done and answered. Great. So in theory, if people have questions, we've got a full QA system set up and ready to rock and roll, and it actually kind of works. But then the question is, how did we actually go through and build this? So the proof is in the pudding, and so obviously we're going to start there. And just to prove it, empty directory, okay? .NET new.
That's called .NET, right?
Dang it. Thank you, Dan. I probably should. So we're going to go ahead and stand up a brand new template. And then for people who haven't seen it before, AZD is the Azure Developer CLI. So this CLI is designed to go through and make your development process interacting with Azure easier. Insert other cloud providers here. We're a Microsoft shop. I'm a Microsoft MVP, so I'm obliged to show Azure. This is going to go through, scan my current directory, figure out what kind of application I am, and then it's going to say, hey, do you want to actually set the config to be able to deploy this? I am already logged in with my Microsoft account, so it will have the appropriate thing. Puddin sounds great. I think that's appropriate. So it has scanned it. It has made some YAML files. It now is ready with all of my infrastructure for my local orchestration. I want to emphasize something here. This is local orchestration, meaning this is for an individual developer building and deploying on this application, right? I have some reason why I need to actually deploy this into my own Azure subscription. This isn't my stage prod environment. This is my deployment for me personally. And what we'll see is that the names of the Azure resources that get deployed out, they get this hash put onto the end of them. And that's intentional because there's a lot of Azure resources out there that have to be globally unique. Right? If somebody else happens to stand up a storage account with the same name as me, well, guess what? Last guy in says, sorry, no, these things have URLs tied to them. We can't have 2 people anywhere in the world with the same name. So that's the point of the hash to be able to go through and do it. And then AZD up. And then we will come back and check on this in a moment because that is going to spin a SQL server, a bunch of Azure identities, a container app environment, and that unfortunately is a full Kubernetes cluster, and that's going to take it a moment. So we'll let it do here, and I believe it should prompt me for a location of where to deploy. West US sounds great since that's nice and close, and then we'll go through and it will figure itself out and say, yeah, sure, I got you. And then we are off deploying. So resource group is out, and it is out there and going. Okay, so let's start breaking down the bits of an Aspire-based application. So if you were to go through and leverage the .NET templates for Aspire, you will find that when you go through and run it, you end up with a couple extra projects beyond what you actually asked to go through and create. The 2 key ones here are the service defaults project and the app host. The service defaults are Microsoft's somewhat opinionated best practices, and they are designed to be a starting point. They aren't designed to be the end all. It's Microsoft finally taking a bit of a stand and saying, okay, this is really the way you should go through and do. A lot of Microsoft templates, they try to be all things to all people, and so they don't take very firm opinions because it's like, well, sure, you could do it this way, you could do it this way, you could do it this way, which is fine until you have somebody going, I don't know what I'm doing, where should I start, right? This is Microsoft going, okay, if you aren't sure where to start, this is a good starting point, but the service defaults project, once it's generated, it's done. That's your code, you can change it, beat it into submission, make modifications to it, pick what you would like it to be. If we take a look inside of it, a lot of these files are going to be adding in things that you might kind of expect in a cloud-based application. We're going to have things like health checks, because when we deploy out our application, we need to know when it's healthy so that it can be pulled in and out of load balancers or otherwise, right? We want service discovery, so that we aren't going through and hard coding the connections between two different things. I don't want API 1 having to know a direct address of API 2. I want it to actually just say, hey, I'm talking to API 2, where's that endpoint, right? Have it actually flow through. Being able to configure out the HTTP client defaults, because when you're making API calls, you want basic resiliency, right? Network happens. Things go down, things don't work. Having all of those things all built and bundled in place. Same with things like telemetry. I'm skimming over a lot of this stuff because for the most part, this is something, if you are interested in the details, feel free to go through and look and read. But again, this is your code to manage and run. If you are questioning, is this the right way for me to start your application? Yeah, this is a good starting point as far as where to go. And most of what I have in here is basically the default. The only big change that I made is I like application insights, so we'll turn that on too. But again, if you're using something else to monitor, you can change that up as you see fit. The other key part here is the Aspire app host. So I'm going to go ahead and hit F5, and you'll note I am playing in a slightly different folder than the one that I just applied my template into, because I didn't want to tempt the demo gods that much. I was limiting where I wanted to go, plus I wanted to be able to tie my DNS to this one's deployment rather than going through and doing it. When you F5 on a Aspire-based application, specifically setting your application host as your startup project, right? If you have an application where you've got, say, multiple backends and a front end, oftentimes people are familiar with multi-project startups where I'm going to go through, I'm going to start my backend, I'm going to fire up my Vite server, I'm going to get all of those pieces connected. Aspire handles that for you. This dashboard is not just a multi-project startup. There's a process behind the scenes called DCP that's actually watching your resources, and it will intelligently know based upon the dependencies between your resources. So if you say, hey, my backend is dependent on my database, well, it's going to make sure that your database starts and is running as in a healthy state before it fires up your backend. If you just do a multi-project startup, it sends all the things, right? And it's kind of on you to make sure, hey, yeah, I know the back end fails, but that's because the database is still warming up, right? Those problems kind of start to go away once you have this kind of orchestration going in place. You'll note I've got a bunch of resources kind of tied in here, just as, we'll make it bigger, just to give a brief summary. There's kind of only three big things here. My app in question is a Blazor front end, so my back end and front end are one little thing. I've got my WebAssembly hosted out of the same app, so there really only is kind of one piece there. But I do also have a SQL database, and you'll also notice that I have this docs in here. I went through and configured out my template to be able to have these things in because I found myself constantly going to a certain set of docs repeatedly, and frankly, just having links to be able to go boop and jump right over to the Aspire docs was really handy. And you do have to make that noise when you click links. It is a requirement. The other thing that you'll note that you have along here is that not all of my things are actually in a running state. I've got this extra container in here called dbgate. So let's take a look at what that actually ends up doing. So if we come in here and I look at my Aspire host, and I'm going to collapse that here, and we'll go right here. So I have, font size good? Getting nods? Great. I have this builder that for anybody who's done ASP.NET Core work, this should look somewhat familiar, right? We've got the generic host. We've seen this kind of builder pattern for setting up our applications. Well, shockingly, the Aspire host is itself that same kind of ASP.NET Core builder pattern to go through and do. The only difference is this distributed application. This is what's getting you that nice Aspire dashboard, the DCP behind the scenes. And we can go through and we can add in resources into it. And in this case, we're just going to pull in an arbitrary container. So this is just something hosted out on Docker Hub, unrelated to Aspire. It's just a convenient web-based application for you being able to browse my database. But you'll note, I've also gone through and said, OK, I have these environment variables that, for dbgate in particular, that let me go through and specify ports, passwords, and I don't actually want to think about what the password needs to be. Because when Aspire fires up my SQL database, it's going to generate something. I don't know what it is. I don't really care. It's going to put a password there. But anything going through to connect it actually does need to know about it. It needs to be able to have some way of passing those variables back and forth. And you'll note I also put down here with explicit start. So with a lot of resources in Aspire, they're going to be designed to fire up, get running, figure out where they are in the dependency tree. But in this case, we said, you know what? Let's wait. So if we come over here, we can actually just click the button, and it goes, ooh, let me fire that up. And we can see here it goes through firing up a Docker container. I didn't have this image pulled down. It downloads the image, starts the running application. And now I can go through and launch it. And now I can actually just go in and say, let's go ahead and look at my database. And look at that. There's my admin@email.com. It's a great username. And so now we can go through and configure our Aspire host to actually give us additional tools. So inside of your applications, if you've got all of these extra things that you normally tell your developers, hey, when we go to view our database, yes, you can download SSMS, you can bring in whatever you'd like. But in this case, we're going to go through and we've got something built in to see if you go through and need it. One of our projects here, we've added this in, and I think we're down to only one engineer who still likes SSMS better because this is just so convenient, right? The other thing is if you say, well, it would be really nice if we could go through and configure port numbers and otherwise so that people who still want to use SSMS, other tools remember their connections and the previous ones. It's like, well, that's kind of annoying if these things are spinning every time. You can go through and configure the ports so that things remain somewhat consistent. The other thing that we have is this lifetime parameter here. By default, Aspire wants to stand everything up, tear everything down. And everything up, tear everything down. That's fine for some things, but oftentimes when you have containers running, it's kind of convenient just to leave them running. Once I F5 in the morning, I'm going to be starting and stopping so many times, I don't want you restarting my container all over. I want to be able to leave that thing up and running and keep it going. And so being able to say, okay, leave the container running, I'll take responsibility for terminating it if I need to, right? Giving me that added little bonus. We can do the same thing. I've kind of hidden away some of the SQL-related ones as well to say, hey, by the way, go ahead, leave my SQL Server up, right? SQL Server isn't exactly that fast to start as a container. It's not horrible, but again, I don't want to wait for it every time. And I'm going to go through and say, I also want to put a data volume behind it because if I don't do that, it's no different than running SQL Server in a regular Docker container. It stands up, it's ephemeral. As soon as the container dies, the database is wiped out. Sometimes that's really convenient, especially if we were talking about maybe I'm running UI tests or integration tests. It's like, it's actually kind of nice to have my database containerized because it makes it real easy to torch it and start over. The other thing that we can go through and do is we can actually say, what would be really, really handy is if when we added in our database, is if we automatically seeded our database. Because how often do you have this situation where I fire up and the very first thing I have to do to configure my application is, okay, you need to go through and add the following records to your database. You need to get this schema applied, run this script here, reload this backpack here, all of that kind of stuff. Inside of Aspire, you'll note I've added in the database, but I've also added in this on resource ready. Because Aspire has this lifetime for its resources that it's able to go through and leverage, we can say, hey, by the way, when the database becomes ready, it'd be really convenient if you'd go ahead and just apply the schema. In this case, EF core. So we're just leverage the built-in EF tooling from the command line to say, go ahead and apply my schema, go through and apply migrations. And I'm even lazier because I often install the EF tools as a .NET local tool, which means when I first clone, you have to run a .NET tool restore. And that doesn't really work well with my idea of I want to clone an F5. .NET tool restore is an extra step. And so I actually, in the event that the first migration fails, I go, you know what? Most likely case of failure is the tools not being there. Let's just restore the tools and then try again. And then we'll report failure, just because I'm paranoid and I wanted it easier. This may not work for a lot of people because people are like, no, my migrations fail for a lot of reasons. Sure, fine. Again, this is Kevin's opinion of what he finds to be convenient, not necessarily a gold standard all the way through. If people are interested in seeing it here, there is nothing fancy. It is literally process start using .NET EF database update, no build all the way through. The one thing to keep in mind when you are running your Aspire host is it is a running application, right? Picture it like just another ASP.NET Core application inside of your solution. And so if you do things like leave off this no build, and then it goes through and tries to say compile a project that's also in that solution while the Aspire host is locking that file, well, you get bit. So don't do that. That part is bad. Okay. Let's go through and take a brief gander back here. So these are all of our resources. If you want to see something pretty, there's a graph. Right. For more complicated things, I'm sure it's more helpful. For our purposes, this is fairly small. The other thing that we have in here is things like parameters, because oftentimes people have things as part of their applications that are, hey, when you go through and start this up, you really need to insert third-party API secret here, right? Maybe you've put that in a key vault and that's a remote resource. That's my preferred way of doing it. But sometimes people say, you know what, this thing here needs to be a local secret. We can add in parameters that the Aspire dashboard will actually prompt users for when they launch to say, hey, by the way, you need to put this parameter in before the application is actually going to go through and go. The other thing that we end up inside of here is along this left, you'll note we've got a whole lot of debugging related features for us. We've got console output that's actually not that bad. Like, there is a reasonable viewer for doing this. When the Aspire team first released, people were wanting to take this dashboard and publish it out to Azure, and the Aspire team's like, whoa, 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 whoa. We built this as just like a local debugging tool. What are you doing? This thing is not secure. Well, eventually the community won out, and so now they actually have it for like Azure Container Apps. You can click a link out in the Azure portal to say, turn on the Aspire dashboard for this container app environment, and it appropriately puts it behind your Entra ID so it's not just wide open, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of data here that you probably don't want wide open. But we can get very nice logs to be able to say, hey, let's go through and let's pick on the database or similar, right? We can see the commands and everything being able to run. So when I'm running my Aspire apps locally, I now have a very easy way to go through and review my logs. I'm not sifting through Visual Studio outputs and otherwise to be able to go through and do. I have these ones in here. I've got various filterings, clears, etc. But we can actually go a step further, right? Because the service defaults, one of the things that it sets up is structured logging, which is very convenient when you want to, say, start looking at spans or otherwise to figure out, okay, this call was slow, but which piece of it was slow, right? There's parts of it that may end up being database related, parts that may be API related. Hey, I want to actually break down and see where those things go. We'll pick on one here if I can find one. Why does it not show any of them inside of here? Oh, because I haven't actually launched the application to do anything. I launched my cloud-based one. You actually have to launch the application to see something interesting. Who would have thought? Okay, there we've at least got something, right? So we can actually jump in and start taking a look at our spans to figure out, okay, here's how much time was spent doing this. Because this is a Blazor application, we do have a SignalR connection, not just straight HTTP back and forth for all of them. Things get a little weird because of that. But the nice part is we don't have to think about necessarily setting that up. The defaults got us at least up and running there. If you spin additional, say, container app jobs, you are on the hook for being able to do those spans yourself, etc. We do also get a wealth of built-in metrics. Again, just things that kind of come out of the box to be able to go through and do of And it demos really nice because look at that, it's a pretty graph, right? Of being able to go through and look at all of those .NET metrics. Again, things that Microsoft has said, you know what, you probably want these types of things on because assuredly, as soon as you go to production, you're going to be questioning, why is my memory usage so high? Where's my connection counts going, right? Why is this thing timing out? And then is when people most usually go and turn on this kind of stuff rather than doing it ahead of time. So starting and getting people of, hey, this is probably where you want to start, and you'll note this thing's actually like updating in real time. The Aspire dashboard setup for debugging is actually pretty slick. Okay. A couple more things to go through and show. So I commented before about those two link ones. So as far as putting in your own custom resources, a link to an external site is, I think, about the bare minimum easiest that you can possibly get to, where you literally are just calling builder, add external service. But if we look on here, builder has all kinds of things that we can go through and do. Add SQL servers, add templates, and the one thing, if my cursor wasn't moving around on me, boom, there we go. These are all extension methods. When working with Aspire, you'll find that if you go and look out on NuGet, there is a large number of extension libraries for Aspire. So depending on what type of infrastructure you are looking to use, you are probably looking to add a NuGet package for that type of resource. What I mean, I've pulled in ones for MS SQL, I've pulled in ones for container app environments and for Azure. Because that's my infrastructure, that's what I'm going for. If you're doing Cosmos, if you're doing AWS, different NuGet packages, different set of extension methods. So if you aren't seeing what you expect here, and unfortunately on the Aspire docs, a lot of times they assume that you've installed the right NuGet package already. They're like, yeah, it's this method. It's like, I don't see that method. Where is it? Well, yeah, you have to look at what package that's in and then bring that in to be able to go through and do. But adding in additional resources into your dashboard is as simple as builder.add insert thing I want here, and then going through and configuring it. The other thing that we can do is you'll note on the Aspire docs resource, which is kind of just a link, but I've also put in additional commands down here. Because again, when I was cloning this, I was like, you know what, shoot, I have to go through and like install the CLI and otherwise. So if we look, go back to my resources, underneath docs, under these little ... I've got a couple extra commands down here. Now, if you add extra commands, add icons, because it just looks pretty. It comes from a particular Microsoft icon set that you can pick anything you want as long as it's from that icon set. But we can go through and add in additional commands to be able to run. This is oftentimes, I think, where a lot of the power comes. You'll note on my database resource that I have here, I have commands set up for restore tools. Go ahead and create me an EF migration. Go ahead and remove the last EF migration. Now, there's a kind of a catch-22 here. I can run the .NET commands to do those code generations. The part that doesn't work is I still have to recompile my assembly with my EF migrations before those things show up. So it's convenient to run it from here because I can put in a connection string that's pointed to my Aspire containered SQL instance. But it's kind of inconvenient because I also have to remember that, hey, by the way, you really need to go through and recompile before you're actually going to see these changes. I can also say, hey, let's go through and let's push my database migrations one more time because something went wrong, maybe I needed to restart something. If you forget to start Docker, conveniently, because that is probably the most common reason for some of these resources not starting, you'll actually see a banner right at the top where Aspire goes, hey, by the way, I don't see the container host running. Did you forget to start your Docker instance? It's like, oh, yep, go through and run. If, hypothetically, you don't like Docker Desktop, Podman also does work. There's a small asterisk there around networking bits, depending on if you need to reference the container host or not. The well-known Docker internal port, Podman's a little different. You have to set that up manually. But other than that, we do have at least one engineer running Podman here. And as far as I'm aware, working great. Mostly because I don't hear complaining, so I assume that means working great. So for your resources, being able to go through and actually pull in those commands. But we can actually get a little bit fancier than just executing commands. So if I go here, and actually maybe I'll pick on the install one. So if I go install CLI, you'll note I actually get a dialog popped up here with fancy links that I can click and all of this other stuff saying, hey, this is about to run an installer. Are you sure you actually want to do this? It is still in preview, and so I will put that small bit of caution on here. So you'll note I'm intentionally disabling a warning, and that warning is, hey, this is a preview API. We reserve the right to change it on you later. So the Aspire team hasn't quite confirmed that this is the end state, but we can actually pull out the interactive service, and then from there, so interactive service there, and then we can start doing UI-related stuff inside of the Aspire dashboard. So we aren't limited to just the UI that they've given us. There's now extensibility to say, hey, prompting the user to input a value, that's kind of a common thing. Popping a dialog to show information, that's kind of a common thing. So we now have those types of interactions available to us where we can actually go through and build it up. I'll highlight this line right here. The markdown is off by default. So if you want fancy formatting, you have to ask for it. Otherwise, it will treat the strings that you pass in as just raw strings, and it looks horrible. So in my opinion, you always go through and turn that on. But once you display the dialog, you then get to do things like, hey, check if it's canceled, return the data, and then from there, take off running, right? So I've got a little check for Windows because I tried to be friendly whether I was going to do PowerShell or Bash. Have not tested this on non-Windows. So if you do grab my template, warning, I know of at least 3 bugs with it. Pull request accepted if anybody feels adventurous. But the point is Aspire, not necessarily Kevin's poorly written voting app. But we can go through, execute the process, reset the variables, and again, we are just functionally running as a web application here, and we're off to the races. Let's check in real quick because I think we're probably done. Perfect. So after running our AZ up, we now have a deployed application. And if I tempt the demo gods a little bit, the only thing that's mildly annoying, log me in please. So when it deploys out, it also goes through and says, you know what you probably want to debug that app that you just put out, we're going to go ahead and turn on the Aspire dashboard on your container app environment, and I'm going to go through and deploy it out. You'll note here the actual application itself. There's our ugly looking hash to disambiguate, and you'll notice it's activating. This is because by default, Microsoft said, you know what, we're going to try to save you a little bit of money. Container apps have a wonderful feature where they scale to 0. So when we deploy out by default, we're going to allow you to scale down to 0 because there's no real point in just burning credits because, again, this is local orchestration, not necessarily cloud deployment, right? This is for developers working. If the developer doesn't like it, go ahead and dial it down. If you don't like that, and again, because Aspire is designed to be extensible, let's back down here. Copilot, go away. We can actually go through and configure the infrastructure that's going to be deployed. Right? So by default, Aspire really wants to do bicep-y things when we're talking to Azure because it's Microsoft and that's their behavior. But we can go through and each of these resources kind of has 2 different states that we can be in. Right? We use the Aspire host both as a running diagnostic tool to be able to have that pretty dashboard to be able to play with. But it is also used to generate a manifest that describes our application because it knows the relationship between my SQL server, my web backend, and it knows that, okay, my Blazor app, it's got a dependency on the database. I've got some UI tests and external HTTP endpoints. But when I am in publish mode, I'm going to go through and when I am actually publishing out infrastructure, I'm going to go through and change the replicas. Right? So by default, I think it wants to do a 0 to 10 replica set with 3 instances or something of that nature. But we can go through and say, you know what, actually, I want to dial that down and control what you actually generate. You can actually also go through, rather than just AZD up and YOLO it all the way out, you can instead just have it generate the bicep files that you then go and customize, modify, do whatever the needful is. If you're adventuring and you like third-party stuff, there's also providers people have started building to go from this manifest into things like Terraform or insert other infrastructure as code, Pulumi, or otherwise, if you want to be able to deploy out that way. Again, separate in the mind the difference between your local orchestration and like a real prod cloud deployment or otherwise, because those are two kind of separate use cases. You probably still want something different. You'll note I've got this kind of dirty environment variable for running migrations when I deploy out from my local orchestration. You shouldn't be running your database migrations on app startup. That's a bad idea for production, naughty. But again, local orchestration, I'm kind of fine with it. So flip the switch, turn it on internally to be able to make it run. So if anybody is curious about that. The last kind of key thing here is this project dependency. So when you add a project to your Aspire host, we're all familiar with this whole dependency, add project pointed at my other project reference. Inside your Aspire host, it doesn't quite work the same with your regular project references because there's kind of two ways that you might want to reference a project. You might want to reference a project like what we've done here for, in my case, my API, to bring it in and say, hey, by the way, Aspire, this is an API project. I want you to bring this in as a resource so that I can go through and leverage it. And you'll note here, this is a project, .NET Conf QA 2025, which matches my project name. And this is a source-generated file. So by default, when you reference a project inside of your Aspire host, there's a source generator that's going to see it and go, oh, project reference. I know what I do. I generate everything I need for that project to use it as an Aspire resource, which most of the time, the projects that you bring in, that's probably what you want. But if we go through and look, we might actually end up wanting to reference more than that. You'll note I've also got a core and a data project here, and only one of those three is actually something that I want to be used as a resource. The other two are just things that I'm bringing in because inside of my commands I want to interact with my database directly and otherwise. So inside of your Aspire app host CS proj, there is this property hanging out down here called is Aspire project reference. If you are going to bring in a project because, again, you're writing a custom command or otherwise, maybe you've got some shared code that you'd like to leverage inside of there. In my case, I have my DI code for registering my database. I want to use that both inside my main project as well as my Aspire host for when I'm interacting directly. I don't want to rewrite that twice. You do need to set is Aspire project resource false to tell it, hey, this is not something for the source generator. Just bring in it as a regular DLL, nothing fancy. I'm just going to go ahead and use code to be able to bring this in. And there we go. Wrong keystroke. Questions? I realize this is like fire hose version of Aspire of going quick. My hope here is that people take this of what is possible in Aspire and then go through and tweak your own apps to be able to leverage it. Okay. Whatever. It is sets the database when you do the local provisioning to put itself to sleep after 5 or 10 minutes or something. So and then it wouldn't be a .NET Conf if I didn't use the word AI. And I've been good. I don't think I've said it yet. Now let's do the AI stuff. So inside of our Aspire dashboard, you'll note our good friend Froggy or Pilot Head, depends on which version you want to look at. So obviously built into the Aspire dashboard, the Aspire team was like, well, everyone else has Copilot. We need Copilots too. So we have, summarize resources. We have Copilot just straight built into the dashboard. We can use it to ask questions about our resources, investigate logs, try to diagnose problems. And that's pretty cool, right? It's nice to have. It's kind of cool to see. It gives us a way of doing it. But it's important to note what this Copilot chat has access to. Your Aspire dashboard, your Aspire resources. It knows what's here. What's missing from that, especially in local development, is I want to tie that back to my code. It's nice that you can tell me what the error is and where it happened, but if I can't tie that back to what change I need to make inside of my code, that kind of only gets me halfway there, right? You've told me what the problem is. I now have to probably copy and paste your output into Copilot into a different terminal to then go through and say, okay, here's what your other cousin said. Can you tell me what I need to do inside of my code to go through and fix this? Right? But we can go a little step further, because they went through and they added in the Aspire MCP server. And now this adds a little bit of gasoline to the fire, is because now what we can do is we can say, okay, I'm going to run the Aspire MCP server. For people who weren't at the Copilot talk that we did, an MCP server is just a running application that has tools and actions available to the AI to be able to do things with. And some of those tools and actions we kind of saw in the Copilot prompt, right? It can look at logs, primarily accessing the metrics and logs and structured output. Those are the key tools of this Aspire MCP. Because most of the time, if you're using AI to interact with this, what you are probably doing is saying, hey, I want to figure out what's going on with my Aspire host. So we've got directions down here. We can install, let's try that one all over again. We can install the Aspire MCP server into this. Somebody closed my VS Code instance. I'm not going to mention his name, but it may have been not me. Okay, so if we take a look here, so this, we'll do this in VS Code, and then be big and go away. All right, so we're going to run this in large mode. So if I take a look at my tools down here, I have already installed the Aspire MCP server inside of Copilot. And this VS Code instance is pointed at the root of my repo, so it now knows something about my code. So in addition to being able to just look at logs, we can now go through and look at code. Check my, and I'm going to do pound Aspire to explicitly reference the tool so that it understands what it's doing. Logs for the Blazor backend, and tell me about any auth issues. So when you start running the Aspire MCP server, it's not tied to just that one Aspire dashboard. Because if we look at the ran list resources, no Aspire app host is running. Well, don't do that. Did I shut it down? No. It's there. Find it. You're going to ruin my demo. Try again before we get too carried away and start insulting you. Yeah, there you go. See, look at that. It's there. All the prep in the world, and AI can stymie you in one shot. So it can now go through, it can take a look at our logs, and it can then start to make connections between what it sees in the logs, especially if there's things like stack traces, and it now has the context of my code to be able to go from errors in my code to fixes in my repo. Right? This is now a major upgrade for being able to debug and solve a lot of these problems. Though I will say, in typical AI fashion, I think most of the bugs I found in my app may have been caused by Copilot, so take it with a grain of salt. But at least being able to go through and debug, because before what would end up happening is I would get an error in my application, and I would say, okay, let me go ahead, copy the error out. Hey, Copilot, I'm getting this error when I try to log in. What is my problem? And Copilot would go, oh, okay, and it would start, it would walk through. Now, giving Copilot access to the Aspire MCP, it can go through, review the logs. If it says, oh, shoot, that looks like a database problem, it can now go pull the logs from the database. Because I'm logging out my SQL queries, because I've dialed the logging up on EF all the way, it can look at what is actually running and say, hey, let me go through and help you with that. If we turn on performance monitoring, you can start saying things like, hey, help me optimize the query. When I go to log in, it's really slow to load the list of questions or list of rooms that I have. And it can start looking through and not just looking at the code that you have, but the actual logs and the SQL that's executed from that code to be able to get it up and running. Okay. Last thing I want to comment on is there is two CLIs, and I talked about one and then kind of skewed over the other one. So there's the Azure Developer CLI, AZD, but then there's also an Aspire CLI. So the Aspire CLI is something that the Aspire team put together to give themselves more commands and otherwise. I was running AZD up because that's the command that works today. The Aspire CLI does have a preview command, Aspire deploy, I believe. That is very much an opt-in, set some environment variables, make it run, as a simpler way of going through and doing the deployment. Personally, AZD is fewer characters. I'm less likely to mess that up. But the Aspire ones does give you extra diagnostics. There's also a really key command, Aspire upgrade. The Aspire team seems to be kicking out updates about monthly, which means these things are coming really, really fast. Like, they are running at the speed of AI as far as pushing things out. The Aspire upgrade is more than just rev my NuGet package. Rev my MS Build SDK, rev any other dependencies or tooling changes that I need to be able to upgrade this. So if you're looking to try to keep an Aspire app updated, the Aspire CLI does make that a lot easier to be able to go through and do. It is also the process that is running the MCP server that allows you to connect. So secretly, you probably have it if you go down some of these workflows without even realizing it, because they kind of just shove it and bundle in and go, hey, by the way, we kind of need this to be able to run some extra stuff. So you will find in their docs, the CLI is something that is very heavily pushed, and I expect to see a lot more updates and otherwise pushed down from that way. They do also have Aspire New for new project templates as well, slightly better than .NET New templates. .NET New templates get updated very slowly. The Aspire CLI, they can update on that monthly cadence, and so you'll note that the Aspire New templates that you generate tend to be a little more up to date, tend to have latest features. They don't get as stagnant as some of the .NET New ones that may be taking a while. Last but not least, it also can help generate your pipelines, because why not? At some point, we do actually need to get all the way to prod, and this has been great for local and local orchestration. So there is an Aspire CLI option. I think it's called CI, if I remember correctly, that will help generate out the YAML that you need to deploy an Aspire application. And so you can use that as a starting point for your pipelines for either GitHub or DevOps to say, hey, let's actually get this thing all the way to prod. Again, it's going to be a best guess because everyone does their stuff a little bit differently, right? Everyone's pipeline, a lot of companies, they've got their own set of custom actions or tasks that they want to use to be able to log for compliance or otherwise. So again, the Aspire team's not trying to do all of the work for you, but they're trying to at least give people a good running start so that people don't get stuck and go, I don't know how to do the next step, right? It's like, here's something that works, but we understand that it's probably not the complete solution for a lot of people. Okay, questions? Austin.
I was wondering if the MCP server that gets hosted with the dashboard app, does that also work in the production version?
Yeah, so the question is, does the MCP server also work across the production version? Not currently, however, there's kind of a weird thing there because you can get the Azure MCP to be able to go out and do similar things, to be able to interact and pull logs and otherwise. And when we say production, local orchestration versus actual production may end up being different, right? Because even though the local orchestration, it's doing a container app, maybe in real production you've got a full Kubernetes cluster, there's something different involved in actually accessing that. And so there may be different MCPs that you go through and pull in that way. Great question. Anything else? Yeah?
Does this only work for a single repo? So sometimes I have applications that they're self-contained, but sometimes they need to talk to each other?
Yeah, so the question of does it only work for a single repo? What about like a multi-repo setup? So you can make it run on a multi-repo setup with two kind of caveats in there. I've got one project where I've got my .NET backend in one repo, and I've got a React app in another repository. I put my Aspire host in my backend repository, and I pulled in, because it's builder.add, I think it's npm package or similar, to do it, and I just literally went .. Right? Go up a directory and go looking for it next door, right? So if you oftentimes clone your repositories side by side, you can do things inside of your Aspire app host where you say, hey, if this other directory exists, conditionally add this front-end resource. So you can get away with a little bit of leveraging it that way to do it. So it does work with multi-repo, but you don't get the same kind of parity there. The other limiting factor is if you're doing project references, right? So that CS_proj reference that you add in for the source generator, that is dependent upon MS build project references, which the projects have to be added to the solution. So it doesn't mean they have to be in the same repo, but it's kind of weird to have a solution that runs the project outside of the repo. So again, you can make it work, but you may end up in a situation where you have a separate SLNX file that also references projects from another repository to get that kind of behavior working. But the rest of it should be just fine, at least as far as standing it up. Anything else? Going once, going twice. Ben.
So it sounds really nice for like the startup of like, okay, I can clone and run. Day to day, is it like if I have a small project and it's like you just kind of click and run, what advantages is this by actually giving me, you know, I'm like, it's not hard to stand up my app. I start my database and it takes me half an hour or whatever.
Yeah.
If I'm getting the advantage there, what's the day-to-day kind of advantage of Aspire?
Yeah, so kind of day-to-day advantages, what does Aspire give me, especially if I've got a simple application that's not that complex to be able to go through and stand up? I think it does depend a little bit. So the ones that I've leveraged it very heavily for, the debugging situation, especially being able to tie an MCP into the logs of being able to grab it, that I have found valuable even on small projects to be able to go through and do. Not all apps necessarily need Aspire. If they are a really simple like CLI app, you probably aren't going to gain that much benefit from Aspire if literally your app is a little terminal application, right? It's cool, it's nice, but you are kind of giving some of the stuff up with that. The other big one that I find is just the spin up time for our engineers is much faster, right? The project that I'm on, it's kind of a revolving door where as engineers maybe between clients, they tend to show up and we go, we've got you for 2 weeks, great. And most of the time for a lot of projects, like 2 weeks, that's your entire onboarding, right? Like you are not productive in that 2 weeks. It's kind of a meaningless time. But we've been able to have people come on, be up and running in a couple hours. It doesn't take a lot of effort when we don't have a lot of work for people to be able to say, hey, you know, clone the repo, F5, you're off to the races. Right? That, for the most of it, for our project, that gets people up and running fairly quickly. We do have a key vault that we put all of our secrets in rather than having them local. So it does mean that to onboard a developer, we have to add them to the right AD group so that they can actually hit the key vault. Otherwise, the thing doesn't start and that kind of thing. So there's a couple steps there, but it's very close to add developer to groups, clone, F5, run, and we're off to the races, which is absolutely amazing. So yeah, so I would say that the debugging are probably the biggest ones, and then just the consistency. Like we don't often fight too many issues with people's environments. This does make the sweeping assumption that you do have a Docker host running on your machine, right? That is an outside dependency, but at least for a lot of our people, they usually have that already. And for the few that don't, it's like, yeah, just go install Docker Hub, right? And get up and running, and you're off to the races. Okay. Last one. Yeah?
How resource intensive is this on your local?
Good question. So the question is, how resource intensive is it? The Aspire dashboard, hardly anything. It's a fairly optimized ASP.NET Core application. What does get fairly resource intensive is when you start adding in resources. Because the resources that you pull in can be quite intensive. Like an Azure AI Foundry local instance, it'll be as intensive as the models you're going to run on it. Because you can run Foundry local out of here, and that's great, but if you start pulling in a large language model on a small machine, you're going to be hurting. For us, for our projects, we've got a SQL database. We use Azurite for a storage account emulator. And then ASP.NET Core and a Vite front end, so our development machines handle it just fine. For other people, I've seen especially, you can run Cosmos in an emulator. Again, depends on how big it's going to be because Cosmos can easily be a resource pig to go through and do. So the Aspire itself is not resource intensive, but there may be a question to be had about the parts of your application that might be resource intensive, right? You are not limited, though, to just local resources in the dashboard. You can point them at cloud resources instead. So if you say, hey, by the way, running Cosmos locally in an emulator, that's way too much. Our devs can't handle it. Our devs are already using a shared Cosmos instance out in the cloud. Great. Plug that in as an Azure resource, and what that gives you is, one, a dependency that you can reference for your local API project or otherwise. And then two, it also populates your connection strings. That way, it brings all of that in, and you don't have to worry about figuring out what's the host, what's the port, how do I do the connection string. Most of the time on those remote resources, it's going to be relying on like an AZ login, so the Azure CLI, to be able to do the appropriate authentication back and forth. So again, outside thing that we expect people to install a lot of times is the Azure CLI and be logged in appropriately. So if I switch my Microsoft account that I'm logged in at, I can now hit this other project but not this one. So often when I switch projects, I am going through and re-authenticating with whatever account is relevant to that project to be able to get it up and running. Great, because right now I'm running on my personal one, but I can't be AZ logged in on my personal and then hit my work project and still expect to have access to that remote key vault in my case. But we also have, on that project, we have a Foundry instance. We don't run Foundry local because the models we're running just would not, our laptops are decent, but they ain't that decent. So we actually leave those resources out in the cloud and just say, hey, we've got a shared dev resource out there. Everybody connect up, but it's still a dependency that we can reference and have all of that service discovery and connections pulled through.